Hello everybody, and welcome to Some Patches Required, a show where we hope to educate and entertain you on the ever-turbulent games industry. My name's Zach, and I will be one of your hosts.
And my name is Aaron, and I will continue to be your other host.
And before we get into the kit and caboodle, the potatoes of everything today, I just wanted to give a quick thank you to everybody for coming and watching the show. Whether you are a returning listener or a new one, we appreciate you. Just wanted to remind you, please also share our show. It's a fantastic way to help us grow, and we greatly appreciate it. And you can even share it with people that you hate. You know, we don't discriminate. Hate and discriminate. Wow, crazy. Anyway, also please subscribe.
This is like,
hit the engagement button. We like that.
Yeah, and kind of a new ask, just on the heels of that. If you have stumbled across us in recent episodes, odds are you probably did so through YouTube, or perhaps you're listening on YouTube right now. And if you did, throw a comment down there. Whether that's just something affirmational, something that you think we missed, something that you think merits further discussion that we didn't get to, take the discussion down to the comment zone. Keep it civil. But yeah, we're hoping we can see a little bit more action down in that space as well.
True. And I'm sure that there will be plenty of things to talk about this week, because we are diving into the wretched world of Nintendo. Which, of course, we've covered a few other times, but Nintendo has found themselves in the news most recently because the Nintendo Direct, the last one that happened, had some interesting price reveals. We're going to specifically be talking about the game side of the price reveals. We're a little bit less interested in the Nintendo Switch 2's price itself as a console. But, Aaron, I'm going to pass it over to you to do a little bit of explaining around what exactly did Nintendo reveal or maybe not reveal about their pricing at the last Nintendo Direct.
So this is a great time for everybody. There was a couple of months ago, we finally got the generalized reveal of the Switch 2. We knew generally what it looked like. That there was going to be a new Mario Kart game. We just didn't really have a name to the best of my knowledge, and there was no information beyond kind of just a little sizzle hype reel for the device. And this most recent Nintendo Direct was kind of the tell-all. Realistically, the Direct itself was a tell-some, because while we did get information on the specs, some of its performance upgrades over the original Switch model, which in this instance actually put it in line with more modern consoles to put it in a good position to have robust third-party support. We got an exclusive kind of Bloodborne-y looking PvP FromSoft game, and a whole bunch of just really exciting stuff about the Switch 2 itself. But the one thing that was not actually present at any point at all during the Nintendo Direct was listings for the prices of the games. And if I'm not mistaken, was the listing of the price for the console actually in the Nintendo Direct?
I believe that the console price was not obfuscated from people like the game prices were, but I also still haven't watched the entirety of the Nintendo Switch Direct. I was just trying to watch for the specific pricing portions. So
yeah, I candidly have forgotten from my watch whether that was in there. But anyway, yeah, it was announced that the Nintendo Switch 2 will cost $450, which is a pretty steep increase over the original Switch's more entry-level cost, which has a couple of potential runoffs that ultimately aren't going to play a huge factor in our discussion today, as Zach alluded to, just because we all know that prices have gone up for, hardware, and there's a good handful of reasons that the system would be priced at that point. But one thing that was just not present at all was the pricing for the games. We had to wait until the pricing for the games came out afterwards in order to realize that Nintendo is pulling some shit in this situation. So the bombshells started soft, which is that Donkey Kong Bonanza is obviously going to, which is a new first-party title, of course, is going to be $70, but Mario Kart World Tour is going to be $80 at launch for a digital copy of the game, which is, for you eagle-eyed observers out there, $10 more than $70, which was the much-discussed price hike from just a couple of years ago. I think it was about 5 years ago that the industry started moving towards standardizing that as the baseline price for AAA games. The first one, and if I'm not mistaken, possibly the only one that Nintendo has released at that price point, was Tears of the Kingdom, which is, of course, like a giant tentpole game that it made sense for them to adopt the industry standard at that point for that game. But now, just a scant few years later, we are already seeing a $10 price increase to $80 for Mario Kart, which has justifiably pissed people off, in my opinion. And I think that was only really exacerbated by the fact that Nintendo pretty obviously knew people weren't going to be happy about that particular number, which is why they didn't show it during their everybody get excited sizzle reel of game stuff. Because if they'd had any sort of confidence that people would take that price sitting down, they wouldn't have been worried about showing it during the trailer montage. So, yeah, we are going to be discussing that and all of its potential very, very negative connotations, runoffs for the industry at large, and then also digging into why the game may cost that much, why it probably shouldn't, and moreover, what it will mean for the larger industry. But it is worth mentioning as well at this point that at the very least, the pricing for Europe has physical editions of any of the Switch 2 games priced at a full $10 higher than their digital versions, which means we are looking at a $90 physical copy of Mario Kart World Tour if you want to have the cartridge, which seems like a pretty wild number to me. But again, that particular price increase has yet to be confirmed for the United States market. There are some misconceptions out there that is across the board, and it may yet turn out to be across the board, but at least for the time being, we only know that is the pricing in Europe for physical games. Yeah, we have many thoughts.
Yeah, well, I would say the reason for those that are annoyed at the Nintendo Switch 2, like the console pricing itself, the reason we're not going to dive into that a ton is because if you look at the price of consoles across the board, they're all roughly that much. Nintendo does normally come out to be the cheapest of the consoles. It's supposed to be the more family-friendly, which in one of the videos I watched accurately stated that actually means affordable. Typically, that's what they mean by family-friendly. And it's generally in line with... Now, we'll get into inflation and why you shouldn't always just use an inflation calculator, but it's generally in line with inflation. It is $50 over the price would be if it was just inflation. If it was just inflation, it would be $400. But regardless of all that, it's not this egregious price difference to me because, you know, the price of GPUs has been pretty ridiculous. Just some computer parts in general have been more expensive. As of late, as other electronics go down in price, a lot of computer components are maintaining or getting more expensive. So I think that for all those reasons, it's not the most egregious offender here out of everything. And you only buy it once, ideally. So it's less of a recurring payment, so to speak. So I'm willing to give them the benefit of the doubt with the console price.
100% agreed on that. The other thing worth noting is that the system itself does not really align with Nintendo's previous hardware strategies, as we've kind of understood them, which is to say innovation at an entry-level price, to the detriment of the system's power, right? Now, I don't think anyone is trying to come out and say that this particular system, with its small form factor, is going to be able to compete with a PlayStation 6 or whatever the hell the next-gen Xbox looks like in terms of raw horsepower. But this is basically just a straight up and down upgraded version of the Switch you already know, right? With the exception of the completely baffling omission of Hall effect joysticks on the system itself, we're talking about a system that is attempting to target a stable 60 FPS basically across the board, with support for up to 120 FPS, increased resolution, and enough sort of juice under the hood to make it an appealing platform for developers to really develop for, regardless of which company they work for, which again is something that we started to see more of in the Switch, but it was often phrased out as being like 2/3 of a miracle that any of these games performed on the Switch at all. And it usually came with a pretty significant performance downgrade. If you were willing to play on the Switch, you could, but I don't think many people would argue that the best experience for a lot of games, I mean, think like Doom 2016 or The Witcher 3 or something like that you would never have seen on a Wii or a Wii U. Those would play on the Switch, but they wouldn't have been necessarily the best experience. And I think what they're doing with this system is targeting that element of things. So yeah, the price for that is largely par for the course. It's definitely steeper than I think anyone would have liked, and it may give people plenty of pause before they purchase it. But I don't think that is nearly as damaging to the industry at a large scale as the idea of normalizing $80 first-party AAA games.
Yeah, and I think that launches us solidly into the meat of the discussion, which is largely why is an $80 per game cost negative? Why is that bad for the games industry? Why is that bad for consumers? All of that. And specifically, my goal today is to explain to everybody listening why the argument that games haven't gone up in price since relative to inflation since 1980 is kind of a horseshit argument that I don't think takes all of the data into consideration. So more of the explanation around that's probably going to come towards the end of this discussion, because we've got 3 points here that we're going to run through, and they get more and more relevant to that point. But starting with the first point we've got here, and this is more of a negative for consumers if we're being completely honest, Nintendo introducing an $80 game as a premium title is a problem, because that is an open invitation to all other AAA game developers, and more specifically publishers, to raise the price of their digital games to a base price of $80. Yeah, I mean that's just what it is. It's going to normalize that across the board. And one of the things that I think you hear a lot is, well, Nintendo games, they don't have a lot of extra bullshit. They don't have in-app purchases as much. They don't tend to have like season passes as much. It tends to be more like you get the base game and it's closer to what, Aaron and I would expect when we were growing up, which was just a solid product at launch. Which in of itself is funny if you look at any of the most recent Pokemon games and how those came out. But regardless of the quality, the problem is that let's assume Nintendo games are fantastic at launch. There's no issues, et cetera, et cetera. If you don't think that 2K, Blizz or Activision, which by extension, Microsoft, I almost said Windows, Ubisoft, Konami, if you don't think any of these other publishers aren't going to look at this and then say, no, wait a minute, They're buying games, them being, the consumer. Consumers are buying games for $80. Why are we selling our games at 70? There's no good reason for them to sell at 70 if they can get 80. And some people will be willing to pay 80, especially if across the board, all AAA games are suddenly $80. People will be forced, air quotes, to just accept that that's the case.
Yeah, there's almost no doubt about that, right? And these sort of incremental price changes definitely lead into the idea that, like, it's not as egregious as if a game had come out and said, well, our baseline pricing is $120. So if someone really wants to play the game and can theoretically afford it, you're not immediately in one moment pricing everybody out, but you are still on that road, right? So yeah, if an $80 game like Mario Kart proves the market is there for $80 games, or it's, even if it's boxing out numbers but increasing revenue, then $80 is just flat out straight up and down the new standard, right? That is now just our new baseline price for a AAA game, regardless of whether that game ought to be $80 or not. And we've seen headlines. If you've paid attention to this space well enough to find our show, then I'm assuming you've seen headlines discussing whether or not GTA 6 would be $100 at launch, because demand-based pricing is 100% a concept that would appeal to these publishers, right? Because why bother to sell a game that's going to be a massive, massive, massive hit like GTA 6 for $60 or $70 when you could get away with selling it for $100, because people are going to want to play the game that much. I think that an $80 price tag on Mario Kart World Tour all but guarantees there's going to be some sort of price fuckery for GTA 6. I would be astonished if that's not the case at this point. So you may hear us back on this exact podcast talking about that in a couple of months, or God knows whenever GTA 6 comes out or gets their pricing announced. But yeah, we are looking at a baseline price increase and the normalization of demand-based pricing, which not only contributes to pricing people out of what should theoretically be a reasonably accessible hobby, but also increases confusion, right? If you don't really know how much a game is going to cost, it becomes harder to budget for, in my opinion. And that's not to say that there isn't a great deal of price variation. I mean, look at the PC marketplace in general and the AA space, and there's definitely a lot of pricing variation out there. But the fact that it's all trending up, and now suddenly games that people are excited for can just drop, $10, $20, $30 price increases based on the fact that market research shows more people want this game than this game, that to me is slightly dystopian.
Well, I think what you just brought up actually makes it's complicated, because there actually is demand-based pricing in order to be competitive. The difference is that now the demand could make games more expensive than what we thought the fence was. Because for the longest time, the fence was 60. Okay. And then it got raised, and it was, 70, which is where it's been. And now we're seeing it go to 80. So I think it's normalizing this idea that if a game is popular enough, it could be more expensive than what we expect the premium price of a game to be. Because, like, for example, I've been playing a lot of Repo. That game is $10. Part of the reason that game is $10 is because no one would buy it for $60. And so, there's demand-based calculations in that. But the main thing is, if a game has had a different price, it was always cheaper.
Yeah, exactly. The demand trended downward from the cap, which was the AAA premium priced game.
Yeah.
And that makes perfect sense. But now we're just seeing a consistent raising of that cap. And now, depending on how the industry responds to this, we're seeing a complete demolition of the cap, right? The sky's the limit here. in terms of how high a demand-based price can go, not so much the other way around where, like Among Us was an enormously popular game that would never have sold for $60 or $70. There's a bunch of double and triple A games and then straight down to indies that are never going to be sold for that much money because no one would look at the game and think that the value proposition is there. But yeah, we're just looking at the inversion of that idea here. So I think it's going to be an experimental, tumultuous, and expensive couple of years for the industry as they kind of figure out what consumers are willing to put up with.
And I think the other interesting time is, and if you're listening to this not in the year 2025, who knows what the situation will be like then, but at this current moment, we're in the middle of a trade war, which has a bunch of like tariffs being thrown back and forth by a certain president that I am absolutely not fond of. And the only reason I bring any of this up is because some people have speculated that this big jump in price on both the console and on the games is due to tariffs. Now, that could be true, but leadership in Nintendo has stated that these are price increases that they have implemented because they believe that the products are worth that new price, the products being both the game, the new Mario Kart game, and the Nintendo Switch 2. They state that tariffs were not a consideration when making these price increases, which means that if there is a tariff-based price increase, it would be on top of the prices that we just mentioned earlier.
And in fact, at the time of recording this episode, Nintendo Switch pre-orders are still paused indefinitely in the United States while Nintendo assesses the impact of the tariffs to see whether a price increase specifically for the American market, most likely both on games and the hardware itself, is in order to, keep them operating at a profit rather than losing money on every title sold as they assume those costs for the extra tariff hikes. So yeah, all of this still stands to change in the upward direction, all because of a deeply unnecessary trade war, which is cool for everyone.
Yeah, and I would say an interesting point that I heard just in related to the trade war that will relate to games. It's not certain that this would happen, but I would say due to the general uneducated nature of, people, including myself, when it comes to purchasing consumer products, other companies that are US based and face less of a tariff will likely still increase the price of their products in the gaming space, because they'll see that people are buying Nintendo products at a higher price. Most people won't understand when something is or is not impacted by a tariff, or they won't complain. And so we could see prices of other games go up even more due to tariffs. So, obviously I place that blame more on the American government and Donald Trump, but there is the reality that all games, even if they are produced in the United States and are not subject to tariffs, they could increase in price, especially if they're AAA games. So just wanted to mention that because I think sometimes people think, oh, well, only foreign goods will get more expensive. And it's like, that's not how capitalism works. If people think they can get money from you, they will try and get money from you, regardless of whether it's an American company or a Japanese company or Korean or, whatever. So.
Right. And it's important also to remember that generally speaking, the price of things doesn't go down. Unless we're talking about something that constantly ebbs and flows with market price, like gasoline. As the price of crude oil changes, there's this constant scramble to get gasoline prices down. But other than that, generally speaking, for products, prices don't go down, right? So once an $80 price tag is normalized, that becomes the price tag. If the tariffs increase that to $85, $90, $90 will just remain the price, even if we manage to survive the next 3.5 years and we can somehow repair the global economy. The price isn't going to go down because the companies will just realize that they'll get an extra percentage that they were giving to the tariff situation, and they can just put that right in their little pockets. People are already used to paying for it. Why would you decrease the price when you've already normalized a cost if you're a company that's seeking, exponential growth?
And game companies have been looking to increase the price of, digital copies of games, physical copies of games for a long time. That's why you'll hear a lot of the complaints around the stagnant pricing of video games for the last 60 years or whatever they cite, right? Or sorry, not 60 years, 40 years. So, it's definitely a situation where, sorry about that. I had an alarm going off. That's fun. We do it live, baby. All right. No, it's definitely a situation where the price could go down from the tariff price. I think that's going to be largely dependent on consumer backlash to the whole situation and what is or isn't successful. But yes, generally speaking, once a price is set, it's going to be incredibly difficult to get it lowered from that price. Especially because all of these publishers, all of these game companies have this idea that pricing has been stagnant and therefore their revenue streams have been stagnated, which is not the case at all. And we'll get more into that here. But another reason that it's bad to increase the price of games is because there's a limited amount of money available within your addressable market. And if you increase the amount of money that is available in the addressable market without the people that are in that addressable market having some kind of a significant wage increase, which ties into our next point really strongly, you're not actually fixing any of the problems that people complain about when they talk about the lack of inflation with game prices. Because you're still selling the same amount of product. In some cases, you might actually sell less, because if you think about this holiday sales example that was brought up to me, games used to be $60, right, Aaron? Now they're going to be $80. And we've talked about this. So I'm more just doing this for showiness for our lovely, lovely listeners. But, let's say that you're a mother. Or a dad, but I think mother's more fun because I like that more as like a holiday shopping thing. I am being a little sexist, I guess. I apologize. But regardless, you are a parent and you are going to, Best Buy. If we really want to do a throwback, we go to Toys R Us. But regardless, you're a parent. You're going to go shop, right? You have two scenarios. You go to Toys R Us. You know that little Jimmy wants the new Call of Duty and he wants the new FIFA game, right? One World, both games are $60. One World, both games are $80. What's going to go through your head as a parent knowing that your son wants these two games?
As a parent who operates on a budget, because I also need to feed little Jimmy, odds are I'm not going to be able to justifiably afford two $80 games. I will probably buy one $80 game and then hope that there's a sale at some point before little Jimmy learns from Call of Duty and takes me down in the night.
Yeah.
No, but the joking answer aside, priced at $60, I am much more likely to buy two games. Priced at $80, I am really unlikely, just personally. I'm likely to buy one $80 game, whereas two $60 games is an easier stomach for me. I would feel personally more comfortable. And I think part of that is just the threshold over 100, just based on the way that at least my brain works as a consumer.
Yeah.
I figure, the 100 is an understandable benchmark. $120 for two brand new games is not terrible value. But once we crest over to the 160 pre-tax, I start to get into the $200 psychology range. And I'm like, I don't know about that. That's a pretty big single-time expenditure.
Well, I think the interesting thing is you're getting out of the area where people are going to be comfortable with impulse purchases because you're going to be so expensive that it becomes an actual financial burden to get your product. As an example, I remember growing up, And there's never been a time in my life where $60 wasn't a lot of money, but with my family that was fairly well to do, largely, at least when I was growing up, $100 was like a point where I was like, oh, this is a lot of money. So the more you approach $100, at least with my, background growing up, the more I would get hesitant, and I am hesitant today to just throw money at that. Regardless of what it is, if it goes over $100, I have some element of pause related to that. $60 is enough away from $100 that, generally speaking, I can impulse buy a $60 game and not feel bad about myself. And obviously that's not the case for everybody, because I know plenty of people that were not able to consistently get $60 games. So, for a lot of people, that's still an expensive consideration. And so where I'm going
and which I say, if $60, because agreed, $60 is not cheap, but if $60 was enough to give somebody pause back when games were $60, $80 is enough to give somebody stop.
Yeah.
At this point.
Yeah. And stop and wait for a deep sale kind of a thing. And there's plenty of people that do that. And I'm friends with a lot of them.
Yeah, no, I think I probably buy one brand new AAA game a year.
Yeah. Well, and the more expensive that they get, the more that it's going to be harder to justify buying more and more of them. And I think the real damage this could do to the industry outside of the consumer side, where people are potentially spending less and less money on, it's not really that they'd be spending less money, but they would be buying less games because they can afford mathematically less games. If you've got $200, you can buy more games with $200 if they're at 60 than if they're at 80. That's just how the math works. So I think that, outside of just less games getting sold, I think it's going to ultimately potentially hurt the indie and the AA space, because if games get more expensive, people are going to want to be less risky with their money because they aren't making more and more. There's been a ton of wage stagnation. So people are probably going to stick more with the franchises that they know they like. They're going to take less risk trying out new ideas because they want that money to feel worth it. Even if you can get, a refund for $80, a lot of people, I think, still don't want to spend that money, even if they can get a refund. And Steam's process is obviously a lot easier than some places, but regardless of any of that, it's going to make people more risk averse, and they're going to want to not try out these games that maybe they would try out before. That was one of the big pitches with Game Pass, is all of these games were under a single subscription. There was no perceived price associated with trying games. And so that was one of the cool things. And I think this could lead to a world where people are over-reliant on tentpole franchises to carry things, because new ideas are even riskier for consumers in terms of, will I enjoy this?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the only spot in which I slightly disagree is I think if the AA and indie space can more or less maintain their pricing, it may actually end up being to the benefit of indie and AA level games, that they are still providing a reasonable entry point, both financially and experientially, for people into the hobby of gaming, where if you can have a high quality experience that sells for $40, people may actually be more likely to go for that than, try X game that costs $1 billion. But that having been said, there are just certain games that, mathematically speaking, people are going to buy. And I think you named off two of them. FIFA doesn't exist anymore technically, but at least not in its previous form. But X sports game that's going to sell 1 billion copies, and Call of Duty that's going to sell 1 billion copies. Those expenses may cut into people's available income for AA games and indie games. I just did the world's worst messed up sentence, but I think my point still kind of stands. But the bigger concern that I even have inside of that space is that within the siloed off AAA realm, those games are going to have to become more and more risk averse, almost by nature, because if we're talking about buying 2 or 3 AAA games priced at $80 in a year, people are going to be buying fewer of those just based on how much available money they have to put into this hobby, right? So they're going to be more selective about which AAA games they buy more than anything. And that means that increased weight is put on each of those individual AAA titles to be giant successes. And as we've seen with sort of the implosion of Disney's strategy and Marvel movies, and as we've seen across the board with the games industry, an over-reliance on broadly appealing tentpole franchises is not necessarily a long-term strategy that pays off for everybody, right? Because those games have to become risk-averse, because they have to appeal to the widest possible audience, because they have to sell X number of copies. Otherwise, they can't even break even, right? So companies will end up making fewer games and relying more on the tentpole titles that they can release at X time of the year. Thus further kind of narrowing the AAA field, but also decreasing the diversity in what you see out there. At least that's kind of what makes sense to me.
Well,
to some degree.
To your original point, I definitely see a world where potentially indie games, because one, I think that they've been more and more the better games. I think they've been the ones that kind of blow up and are these massive successes as of late. I feel like that happens less with AAA. I do see a path where that becomes more of the focus, where most people are existing because they get priced out of AAA. I think it's hard to know, because there's like this portion of the gamer community, game playing community, that I don't really understand that well. And that's the people that really only buy AAA games and they don't exist outside of that space. I don't fully understand what it would take for them to ditch AAA. And so it makes it hard to know, one, I don't really fully understand what percentage of the player base is that. I would suspect it probably is the majority, just based on the data that says most people only play like 3 different games. Unlike myself, who plays a shit ton. So yeah, I don't know. I could see that. I would need to look at the data and really like process my thought on that more. But regardless, yeah, I definitely could see a potential world where that happens. I think to the latter point that you were talking about, I look at this kind of like the battle pass phenomenon, where battle passes were really competing for your time. Like, that's ultimately the biggest thing that all game studios want. They want your time. They want to monetize your time. But the problem with that is they're constantly making new products. Like Nintendo, even though they've got one game that they want you to keep spending hours and hours on, they're coming out with other games and they want you to buy those other games. But what if you're so hooked on one of the games that you don't buy their other game, and maybe you would normally? They're technically like cannibalizing their own market. And I think that could happen with an $80 game, because if you buy 3 $80 games a year, well, that's one $60 game that you're not going to buy, right? Assuming you can even afford that many games a year. So my point with all of this is the price increase could cause them to sell less of another game. And it doesn't even need to be a tiny game. Maybe it's a AAA game franchise that someone likes, but it's not their first game choice of the year, or their second or third. Maybe it's their fourth or their third. You know what I mean? Like,
all their friends are playing this game.
Yeah, exactly. And so it could hurt sales of games in that way, just because I think there's a limited amount of money available, and they're just going to condense that into less and less games. And if they keep trying to sell as many games as we are now, it's not going to work. It's just not realistically going to work. It's going to put everything in more competition with each other for people's money.
No, I agree. I think generally speaking, the idea of what we're talking about here, and I think this kind of dovetails nicely into our next set of points, is that making games less accessible to people on a financial level does not serve the best interest of the player or the industry.
Yeah, no, it's a big issue. And here I think is probably, maybe we should have brought this up earlier, but here's probably the best time to talk about the common argument as to why game prices need to go up. People will say game prices need to go up because they've been relatively stagnant since 1980 is what a lot of people will say. And I will say some games I think were $60 in 1980. Not all of them were. A lot of the games seem to be around $30 to $40. So if you're looking at all of this from an inflation perspective and you simply plug that into an inflation calculator, games today should be anywhere between $116 to $154, which I think most people would look at that and be like, I am not going to pay $116 or $154 for a single video game. And I think you'd be
talking
right
about
to.
Premium tier expansion pricing.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, this is like for the air quotes, creme de la creme, right? The premium AAA games should, air quotes, cost that much. And there's a lot of issues I have with this statement, but perhaps the biggest one is that I think when you're pricing your products, I think you need to look at the amount of money available that people have in terms of disposable income and price accordingly, especially if you're a company like Nintendo that claims to be the family-friendly company, i.e. the affordable company. I think it's important to understand that wages, at least in the United States, have been stagnant since 1970 relative to the inflation rate. And if you look at games, they're technically about 55% cheaper today, Aaron, than they were in 1980. So they are technically cheaper. But one, I think that's a good thing because I think it makes it more affordable in a world where we've seen wage stagnation in the United States. And I'll get into some of those numbers and back that up later after I give you a chance to respond to what I'm saying, Aaron. But I think that's a good thing. I think games should be affordable. I don't want this to be a luxury hobby. And then the other thing is, since 1980, a few different things have happened. One, we've moved away from physical distribution of video games. We've moved away from all of that towards digital platforms. I was talking with one of my friends, and he was saying that when you used to work with physical resellers, they would take, at times, up to 50%. And I think that also included like warehousing and manufacturing and all of that, but up to 50%. Now,
and for clarity, this was a friend who used to work in that side.
Yeah,
of the
sorry,
industry,
this is a friend that
just like Dougie at the coffee shop.
Yeah, this is one of my friends in the industry that used to work in physical distribution for like CDs and whatnot. Whereas now digital storefronts like Steam, which takes a high percentage of 30, I mean, look at that. You're saving 20%. That's a ton of margin on your product when you're selling it. In addition to that, how many different games have in-app purchases, Aaron, or like battle passes or season passes? I mean, it's most of them, right? So like, what is that $60 or $70 price? That's really the entry fee. There are prices on top of that people consistently pay. So a game hasn't just been $60 in such a long time. And my final point, at least in this little section, is that a lot of games are subsidized by big spenders, which the industry, so kindly calls whales, who can spend upwards of $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 on a game. So my point with all of this is games have not been hurting in the way that they like to make you think when it comes to revenue. The problem isn't how much revenue games are making. The problem is that capitalism demands the line go up, and that companies keep inflating their budgets, even though consumers don't necessarily want them to be putting out these quadruple A games that they seem to think they have to do all the time. Anyway, I'm going to shut up, Aaron, so you can respond.
No, I think that is a worthwhile series of points. One additional caveat, just in case people actually follow my advice and leave comments. Yes, I know that they're back in the early days of games and whatnot, especially home consoles. There were games that were priced at higher premiums, right? Like I think Final Fantasy 3 in the United States, which I think is 6 everywhere else or 5 everywhere else, I can't remember, was a higher cost game, probably based on its length at the time. But we're not really talking about that because the industry itself was so much less rigid and codified back then. There were fewer consistent practices across the board So I don't think that argument holds as much water when we're talking about the current landscape. But yes, that having been said, the idea that the monetization strategy is locked to the baseline MSRP of a video game hasn't been relevant for 2 full console cycles. Essentially, since network capabilities were introduced into the hardware, games have not remained $60 to have the full, complete experience, with obvious exceptions. But generally speaking, expansions cost money, microtransactions cost money, cosmetics cost money. Game companies have become very adept at finding ways to take the base value of a game, whether that be $50, $60, or $70, and ask you to continue paying on top of that in order to increase their revenue above that baseline access point. You both buy a game and access to a storefront where you can purchase more stuff for that game. That's not even necessarily factoring in free-to-play monetization strategies, but like as an example, Assassin's Creed Shadows, which launched just last month, is a $70 AAA game that does have a networked battle pass component, as well as in-game currencies that you can purchase with real dollars, that people are buying, no matter how vocal the general player base is about how much bullshit that is. And they're right, it is bullshit. There's no business that has no business being in a game priced that way and marketed that way and sold this way. But that's the world we live in. So yeah, that just hasn't been, since DLC and cosmetics and battle passes and everything else were introduced into the general gaming experience, $60 has been the recommended price. It's very similar to playing a free-to-play game truly free-to-play, which is not what the majority of people do, I believe. Do you know what I mean? Like, I have this dumb incremental game called Egg Inc. on my phone that I picked up in a dark moment several years ago and started playing completely passively. And that is a game that is 100% designed based on its progression to get you to pay into it. And I have decided that I'm not going to pay into that game at all, and it means that my progression is basically flat after a certain point. That does not make the game more fun, but it does put me in the minority of people who aren't paying for any of the boasts or bonuses.
Yeah.
Boosts or bonuses. And all that fun stuff. So yeah, the point being, full game experiences are not $60 until a year and a half after they come out, when they release a Game of the Year edition or a complete edition that includes all of the bundled DLC for the original price of the base game. And that's just a value add for the company at that point to get people who they couldn't sucker in on the initial launch of the game. Anyway, that was my long sort of response to what you're talking about. So yeah, the baseline price of a game may have remained stable, but the actual price of the gaming experience 100% has not. And that's just a more nuanced conversation than the industry people who are talking about stagnation of game prices want us to have.
Yeah. And I think really the last set of kind of presented metrics that we have before I get into the purely kind of blabbering about my opinions or frustrations with opinions, etc., at least from my side, Aaron, is if you look at a lot of the data from reputable, institutions like the Consumer Affairs, they have an article that we have linked, and it's called "Comparing the Costs of Generations," and then in brackets it's got 2025. And in here it states that Gen Z has 72% less purchasing power than baby boomers did in their 20s, and that labor earnings have gone up 93% since 1973. And specifically, that's the median incomes adjusted for inflation, but that the Consumer Price Index, or the CPI, which is like a general index that it basically illustrates how much prices have gone up, right? There has been an increase since 1973 of 586%. 586%. So the cost of most goods, it's really the cost of living has gone up 586%, which is 5x, over 5x what people's earnings have gone up, right? And the one thing that I think is extra interesting here, Aaron, is you'll look at some items and they've actually relatively gone down in price. Like I mentioned, video games are like 55% cheaper or whatever it is. So you might be like, okay, well then what's going up in price? And I know a lot of people like to reference groceries because of the political climate right now, but it is not groceries necessarily. It is housing, rent, which gets separated. So it's homeownership, rent, and healthcare have all gone up astronomical amounts. And so is private school and public school tuition. For example, the price of houses since 1973 has gone up 1,045%. All of this means that people have less disposable income available to them to spend on anything. And this includes games. And that goes back to my one point, Aaron, of where I was saying the games industry needs to understand that though they haven't kept up with inflation, people don't have extravagant amounts of money to spend on video games in comparison to 1980. People could afford more video games per dollar in 1980 than they can now. So it doesn't make sense to reference inflation when inflation would have game prices go up to a percentage that people just can't afford. So anyway, there's a bunch of other numbers that people can dive into. If you have any specific questions about any of that, feel free to comment and, I can help share resources and whatever. But ultimately, my point here is people cannot afford for games to keep going up and up and up with price. The games industry needs to do something to make sure that people can afford games so games don't end up being some kind of luxury hobby like skiing or snowboarding, where for like a day pass, you spend $400, depending on where you go. That is the world I do not want.
100% same. I think, I think neglecting to recognize that people's discretionary spending habits have changed by necessity when discussing these pricing models. And the thing is, I'm pretty confident that these aren't things that the extremely well-paid people at all of these companies haven't been made aware of. If we sitting here in two different states at our level recording a podcast can figure some of this stuff out, it's not like their research teams haven't also figured this out, right? But the runoff just could be exactly what Zak's talking about, where, you're pricing people completely out of the hobby because our spending power is just not what it used to be. If everything accelerated and went up at the exact same rate, wages went up at the same rate as costs, went up at the same rate as X, went up at the same rate as Y, then we could justify that sort of flat growth. But no, I mean, everything is not accelerating at the same pace. Life is becoming more expensive to live, which means even if the number on your paycheck is going up, its usability is actually going down. And what gets cut first? Food? Heat? Or Donkey Kong Bonanza?
Yeah, no, everyone's going to choose to play Donkey Kong over eating, for sure. Yeah. I'm trying to find, so I linked you that one presentation, and I'm now realizing I didn't put a lot of that data into the document. But what I do want to just illustrate is this conversation happens while games are acting like they're in this like death saving throw around how much money they make. Any of the issues around games right now are generally due to AI and layoffs. And I'm going to be real honest, a lot of the layoff issues could be resolved if this is not the way to resolve it. And I'm going to illustrate that with this metric that I found on this PowerPoint presentation from Matthew Ball. Between 2011 to 2021, the growth of the games industry didn't just beat its historical averages, it significantly outpaced the global growth benchmarks. So as economies around the world, like real world GDP, US real world GDP, all of that kind of stuff, games was 3.4x times the rate of world real GDP. So it was beating the world economy in terms of how much it was growing. My point with all of this is games have been doing better and better, and they're demanding more and more money from us, which I think is ridiculous when clearly they've not been having a growth issue. Now, I will say, during the pandemic, there was a big boom caused by people being inside. So that probably does bias some of these numbers, but games has been doing incredibly well. And it feels like right now, instead of solving the problems, the industry is like, well, we'll make the consumers pay for it. We don't want to fix the problem and make sustainable game development. We're just going to make the consumers pay for it because we don't have any better idea.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I find that offensive.
I've heard. Yeah, that's the best response sorry to cut you off. But that is the best response I've heard to the argument that a price hike is warranted because games cost more to make. It is true that games cost more to make. It is also true, much in the case of I won't elaborate on this, but look up the budget issues for the most recent Indiana Jones movie and how that movie ended up becoming like a $400 million in the red flop. And tell me that there aren't issues in the production pipeline somewhere that couldn't be reasonably ironed out in order to make the games less expensive to produce. And that's not even with the understanding of like executive pay being completely out of control while developers' job security isn't even a factor. Like, it's not even considered. It's actually their job security or lack thereof is actually a tool to inflate growth numbers. But that's beside the point to some degree. Yeah, the idea that games cost more to make, so they should cost more for us to buy, does not necessarily hold water based on what Zachary has just said.
Well, it's more from. I think a lot of people, if they hear that, they'll be like, "Wait, what do you mean? If the game costs more to make, of course they should sell it for more." My argument is not necessarily that that's not true intrinsically. My argument is if you are a good business owner, you should understand the addressable market and how much disposable income people have and create projects that fit within the confines of that addressable market and the money that they have available to spend. If you are making expensive projects that people can't afford and the only way to address that is to increase the price of your games, in my opinion, you are failing to properly develop. That's what it is. Like, it's not this is why I think ultimately, like, the whole pricing thing that you brought up earlier with games potentially being $60 in 1980 doesn't matter, because my argument isn't that games can't be expensive, or it's not even like if you make an expensive game that like it shouldn't be expensive. It's just that I think it is bad business for the games industry to just assume they can keep having these skyrocketing budgets and like also then increase the base price of entry. Like, I think that is a failing model. I don't think people have the ability to sustain that. I don't think the market can sustain that. And I just think you're bad at doing business if you don't understand that people have less money to spend today. Make more concise projects that don't cost so much damn money. Indies are doing it. Double A's are doing it. Stylized graphics are in. What's that game that just came out? South of Midnight for Microsoft.
Looks beautiful.
Looks great. And I've heard that it's not the most innovative game, but that it's like just good. Like, it is just a good game. And granted, that's probably more in the AAA space. But the reason I bring that up is like stylized graphics are in. You don't need these high fidelity, crazy ass games like, people seem to think we do. And I think people are showing that when they buy games like Repo, when they buy games like BattleBit, when they buy, Lethal Company, some of these other games that we've talked about. I mean, even like Helldivers. right? I don't know. It's just frustrating because I hear a lot about the entitlement of gamers, but what about the entitlement of the games industry to your dollars? You know?
Yeah.
The games industry needs us more than the consumers. The games industry needs consumers more than consumers need the games industry. So if anyone deserves to be, entitled to a good product, it's consumers, like by definition.
Yeah.
Now, of course, gamers are not my favorite group of people, and they have plenty of stupid opinions about race and gender and whatever, but and their inclusion in games being problematic. But
sounds like you've caught the woke mind parasite.
Oh boy, I did. The last thing I want to open this up to you because we had a discussion about it before we log off. This is one of the other big things that I hear a lot, and I know you and I are generally aligned on this. So I just want to, kind of hear you run through your process with this before we get off. We've seen some people compare video games to other activities and then say that try to come up with some kind of mathematical algorithm of enjoyment per hour and whatever it is. What's kind of your response to that, Aaron? If someone comes up to you and they're like, okay, well, but think how much you've been playing, like assume you paid some amount of money for that egg game, right? The enjoyment per hour, if you've been playing that for years, Aaron, that's better, dollars spent than going to the movie theater or going on a vacation or, pretty much anything, honestly.
Yeah. The problem is that's just not how the product works, right? If you want to start charging that way, there's a model for that inside of games, and it's called subscriptions. That model already kind of exists, right? But at the same time, I don't think that you can compare apples to oranges in that way, right? Like to the movie theater example, for instance. Let's say that the overall, when you go to the movie theater and you pay for a ticket, right, you are not paying for the length or the quality of the film. You just aren't, right? Otherwise, a ticket for Ari Aster's movie Beau is Afraid would have cost $45 at a low end theater, because the movie was like 4 hours. Do you know what I mean? Instead, you pay for the experience, right? So at a reasonable movie theater in a Midwestern city, a matinee ticket's going to cost you maybe $11, right? And that is completely agnostic of the length of the movie and the quality of the film, right? That is your ticket to enter this experience. And I think that works just as well for games, right? Like there are a lot of games. Look at The Order 1886 is an oft-cited example of a game that has like very little content but still launched for $60, which now seems quaint because now people would be like, "Oh, they're only launching that game for $60. That's a deal." But yeah, no, I don't think that you can run a little ticker tape and try and charge everybody for every minute that they play in a game.
Well,
because everybody's going to get something completely different out of it.
That's not necessarily what I meant. I more meant like people will say, okay, the new Mario Kart game is $80. Now, if you're going to play that game for a year with 2 hours a day, and then you do the math, and they're like, it's like 30 cents an hour is what you're paying for this entertainment. It's not them saying you should literally monetize like with a subscription. It's them saying compared to a movie, it's a better bang for your buck. And I think that the big thing, what you and I define as enjoyment is drastically different. That is not a benchmark that is consistent, and therefore I don't think it should be applied, because I might value FaceTime with a friend more than I value in a year of playing Mario Kart by myself at home. Like the enjoyment per hour is not a smart way of doing pricing. It is a way to do it, but it's also dumb in my opinion because especially in this day and age with so many AAA games that just are bad, you don't know how many hours you're going to play a game. You might think you do, but maybe you get busy and then you forget about it and it just collects dust. Like, it's such a stupid metric for assigning value because not everyone gets the same amount of run, like the Persona games. I've never beaten one, but in theory, they've got like almost 100 hours of content, and I've only ever put in 40. So technically, I haven't gotten the bang for my buck. If anything, I've been screwed out of a lot of stuff. So
demand a refund.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think games want to make that comparison because then it's like, well, I only played your game for 3 hours, and I'm supposed to get 60 hours of enjoyment to get my full. It's not a place I think people want to end up going.
No, and especially if we're just talking about like the sheer number of repetitive tasks that anyone does in a video game, not like the satisfying repetitive tasks, but like think your bog standard Ubisoft open world checklist sort of thing. In that case, every single game should be proving its value, much like they kind of were there for a while and to some degree still are, by just artificially inflating the length of the game. Right? If you want to get 100% of your value out of this game, buckle up for 450 hours of searching for MacGuffins. That does not, to me, increase the quality of the game or the number of hours of time the number of hours I spent enjoying the game, because there is a difference between the number of hours one spends doing something and the number of hours one spends enjoying it, which all gets into very subjective territory that can't be quantified. And yeah, I mean, for a bunch of different reasons, I don't think that is the argument that people want to make. Well, it's clearly an argument that some people very much want to make, but I don't think that it's a strong argument to try and prove their point that games are, cheaper than they should be.
Yeah. Yep. Well, honestly, I could keep talking about this for a longer period of time because I think this is a thing that has a bigger impact on the industry than people even realize. I'm not even saying that necessarily the $80 increase has this massive meaningful impact, but what I do mean is if games keep getting more and more expensive, there will become a point where consumers just can't afford it, especially if wages continue to stagnate in the United States. This is largely me talking about this all from the US perspective, not necessarily global. But still, it's not something that, let's say 5 years from now, they increase the price of games from 80 to 90. I don't think that's going to feel any better for the market in the US, the people that want to play games. I think we're going to do this again, and I think it's going to be equally as valid. Because it doesn't stop. Like, where does it stop? And the problem isn't that it doesn't stop. It's that people don't have the money to make up for the difference, right? They have to spend more and more on housing. Housing's going to keep getting more expensive. Healthcare is going to keep getting more expensive. Tuition's going to keep getting more expensive. The amount of disposable income that people have is going to get smaller and smaller. So if games want to take a bigger and bigger portion of it, they really need to justify it. And candidly, I just don't think it's a smart way for the industry to go. So, yeah, that's probably kind of my sign off with this is I don't think all of the criticisms that I've heard of the people that are criticizing the price increase never mention disposable income. They never mention a lot of these economic factors in the United States. And I think that it's foolish to separate these two things. I think that's an incredibly dumb thing to do. And they also neglect the fact that there's been increases with like IAP and just the amount of content, microtransactions people buy in a game. They're disingenuous when they say games are only $60.
Right. Yeah. No, I think those are both very valid points. And to kind of use one to dovetail into the other. Again, taken in isolation, purely in isolation, the concept of a game costing more is not the most egregious thing going on in the world today, even economically. But again, nothing exists in isolation, right? And I understand that each individual industry has to remain, afloat, and prices go up and whatnot. But like, I don't feel that I'm in a better position to spend $80 on a game this year than I was a $70 game 3 years ago. It just is the concerning thing, like Zach said, is not the specific number, it's the trend. The trend of the numbers consistently going up now at a more accelerated pace is what worries me, because at this point we might not make it to 2030 before $90 games are normalized. And then even if we do make it to 2030, how long from there before it jumps up even further? And unless the disposable income situation in the country, which is regretfully not something, well, actually not regretfully, thankfully is not something underneath the control of the games industry itself. Unless that situation itself resolves, then you are just by math going to begin pricing more and more people out of this hobby. So I think, yeah, like Zach said, we tried our best to have a fairly well-researched, more nuanced discussion about why this trend is concerning, because it's not just angry that I have to pay $80 for Mario Kart. It's not just angry that we might have to pay $100 for GTA 6. It is the concern that the trend of prices going up is just going to accelerate, and it is going to do so regardless of the fact that as these prices go up, our disposable income remains stagnant or goes down. So yeah, I wish I could say that I was confident this is the last time we'd have to have this conversation, but I really don't think it is. We have plenty more research that we didn't even get to in this episode, but we are already at a longer episode than we've shot for in recent times, so I'm comfortable calling that my closing salvo. Would have been nice to be able to afford a Switch 2 or maybe one of its games, though. I'll say that.
Yeah, no, the
Not
story,
that it's a groundbreaking machine, but
the story will definitely continue. I'm sure that once the Nintendo Switch 2 comes out, we'll probably have some coverage of some of the products there.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
But yeah.
It's a real bummer that a lot of the stuff looks kind of neat, other than the fact that the streaming runs at like 5 frames a second, which they keep showing with like pride, which I think is kind of embarrassing.
Yeah, and a subscription gated button on the controller is a uniquely dystopian sort of 2025 move.
Yeah.
But
it's definitely very coded with you need to pay a subscription to use the AC in your car, kind of a thing. Except yeah. But yes, no. Anyway,
Jesus. Yeah. Anywho, now that we've said a bunch of kind of fuck yous, we could always go for some thank yous.
Those are the better yous available to us at this time. Well, I'll start off. I'll just say a quick thank you to MosscatMarket, who of course helped us with a lot of our initial art, and our album art, our thumbnail art, all of that at the very beginning. We appreciate her and everything that she does. So make sure to check out MosscatMarket on both Etsy and on Instagram. Everything should be under MosscatMarket now and not eDougie Art. So go to MosscatMarket.
Indeed, it's good stuff. As is, of course, as I tell you every episode, the music of Beach Girl. Beach Girl provided our wonderful intro and outro music, which always, I was going to say it gets me into mood to podcast, but I don't actually listen to it before we start recording, but it gets me in the mood to edit the podcast, which is when I mostly listen to that song. But all of their other great tunes, which you can find on SoundCloud, Bandcamp, YouTube, basically anywhere that digital music is housed, Beach Girl is. All of those tunes are there for your listening pleasure. And there is pleasure to be had in the listening of it. That was a great sentence, but their Beach Girl's music is better than my diction.
Okay. I misheard that for a second. I know what you said, though. So
I chose that one. I chose that one on purpose.
All good. Well, with that, thanks everybody for tuning in. To Aaron's original comment, if you have made it this far, leave a comment. How much money would you be willing to spend on a game like the upper end? Like realistically, if stuff kept going up and up in price, what's the upper limit that you'd be willing to spend? I'm certainly curious about that kind of information. Leave a comment. We appreciate your engagement. And I am signing off.
Indeed. And what gets cut first? Food, heat, or Donkey Kong Bonanza?